I don't know where Tam is, but I suspect she'll be right back. All right. Sorry that break took a little longer. Appreciate your patience. Have we will resume now, and depending where it falls, kind of logically take a lunch break somewhere closer to 1 o'clock. During our lunch break, we will take care of our closed session because that's more efficient. So we'll take a... Oh, good. We have more time. So somewhere between 12 and 1. Thank you. Huh. So that clock doesn't work. That door doesn't work.
Well, no, but the clock up above.
Clock up above works.
Red
All
one
right.
does. Yeah.
And then, so our lunch break, I don't know, Mr. Lawfer, how long do you think we need for the closed session? Might take a longer lunch break?
You know, my guess is no more than 45 minutes to an hour.
All right, so we will take an hour for lunch when we take our lunch break. Okay, but then we'll have taken care of the closed session. All right, good. All right, we are on to item number 5.
Right. Good morning, Chair Marcus and members of the board. I am John Borkovich, the Section Chief of Groundwater Monitoring at DWQ. I'm joined by Janice Zinke, the Unit Chief of Oil and Gas Monitoring, Eric Gilman from our Office of Chief Counsel, Dr. Bradley Esser from Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories, part of the Lawrence Group, and Dr. Kim Taylor of the U.S. Geological Survey. Today, we will present for your consideration the proposed model criteria for groundwater monitoring in areas of oil and gas well stimulation. Model criteria outline the methods and requirements to be used in assessing the potential effects of well stimulation on groundwater resources. We will begin, or we'll turn over to Brad Esser of Livermore Labs as our expert, who will present their final recommendations that were delivered to us late last month and give an overview of what their recommendations were to us that we were to consider for the development of the model criteria. And then following Brad's presentation, we'll turn it over to Janice, Janice Zinke, who will present an overview and discuss the significant changes that were made to the model criteria drafts in response to the public and stakeholder comments, as well as expert recommendations from Livermore Labs. Before that, I'd like to note that we have change sheets number 1 and number 2 at the back of the room, a printout. Change sheet number 2 came out late. It's a one-sheeter. It's at the back of the room here at the chambers. So right now, I'll turn it over to Dr. Brad Esser to give an overview of the recommendations for us to consider on development of the model criteria.
Great. Nice to see you again. Thanks for joining. Turn on your mic.
Can you hear me now? I'm Brad Esser. I'm at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, and my charge was to develop expert recommendations for model criteria under SB4. Let me see. Okay, so as John said, we delivered our final report at the end of June. This was a relatively large report. It begins with an overview of well stimulation in California, of the distribution of protected groundwater in California, and then analytes that or chemicals that have been used in oil and gas development and in well stimulation, and then monitoring efforts in other states and what we know about monitoring for impact, and then goes on to make recommendations for both area-specific or well-by-well monitoring and also for regional groundwater monitoring. I'd point out that it has 2 appendices, one on some efforts to map groundwater salinity in the San Joaquin Valley, and another on a review of depth-discrete multi-level groundwater monitoring technologies. You know, the first decision that needs to be made is what groundwater should be monitored. And essentially, we considered two standards. These are not drinking water standards, but groundwater standards. One is for waters that are have designated beneficial use as municipal or domestic water supply. The second is a criteria that is consistent with EPA's definition of underground source of drinking water. We recommend monitoring groundwater up to 10,000 ppm TDS. So that would be water that contains less than 10,000 ppm, that occurs in an aquifer of sufficient quantity for beneficial use, sufficient sustained yield to actually be used. And then we also recommended that an exemption not be made for hydrocarbon-bearing water. We think it important to monitor those waters. And the rationale is fairly simple. You know, we are in the midst of a drought. You saw your conservation efforts were highlighted this morning. We need access to all the water that we can get. We know that desalination of brackish groundwater is technically feasible. And then secondly, this definition of water to be monitored is consistent with definitions in the Underground Injection Control Program, which is operative within these oil and gas fields. So that simplifies things a bit. Okay, but having made that recommendation, what we quickly come to realize is that the distribution of groundwater with TDS between 3,000 and 10,000 ppm is poorly known. So we recommend that groundwater monitor plans include data relevant to determining aquifer salinity, and that the state, and this could be the Water Board, this could be DOGGR, this could be Department of Water Resources, systematically determine the spatial and vertical distribution of usable groundwater in all basins containing oil and gas fields. Okay, so essentially there were three programs that SB4 required. One was well by well or area specific or area wide. Another was for neighboring wells, and the third was for regional. We addressed the operator required well by well monitoring and the regional program. We didn't address the neighboring well program. You know, to design a groundwater monitoring network, you first have to define what the goals of the monitoring program are. So I'm going to start with what we don't recommend. We did not recommend that a monitoring network be designed for early detection of leakage from an individual stimulation. You know, decades of experience with contaminant hydrogeology of surface contaminant sources has taught us that the best approach is to develop a site conceptual model and then to design your network on the basis of that model. It also has taught us that one up gradient and two down gradient wells is rarely adequate. So that approach would be extremely difficult given the scale of the fields and, you know, how many thousands of feet these wells penetrate, and also because of data availability. You know, we don't know enough about geologic strata, the hydraulic properties of strata between the hydrocarbon zones and the freshwater zones to be able to develop a site conceptual model, or we don't know enough about the contaminant transport mechanisms. In addition, real-time pressure testing at the time of well stimulation will detect major loss of fluids out of the target zone and is a better approach. But we do recommend groundwater monitoring. You know, it's still necessary. Well stimulation does have the potential to impact groundwater. Real-time pressure testing won't detect minor loss of fluids. It won't detect surface spills in association with well stimulation. In addition, over time, well integrity can be compromised. Cement degrades, substance can cause casing failure. So there is a need for groundwater monitoring. We recommend that in the initial phases of this program, the emphasis be on baseline characterization. To detect impact, we're going to need to know what the baseline for these waters is. And often in these fields, there are very few wells. So we don't know a lot about groundwater quality in these wells. And so we need to know what the spatial and temporal variability of water quality is. And we also need to account for any legacy impacts because we're trying to monitor for current or future activity. So we need to know if there have been impacts in the past. So in our recommendation, a typical stimulation would require monitoring 3 aquifers. A shallow, high-quality groundwater aquifer, this is the water you care the most about. It's also the water that's most susceptible to any kind of surface operations in association with the well stimulation. We recommend monitoring the base of protected water. This would be the aquifer that would be most susceptible to transport of contaminants not associated with well bores. So hydrofractures or geologic fractures, this would be the first aquifer to see it. And then the base of fresh water, which functions the same way as the base of protected water, but for waters that have designated use as drinking water source. And this will require, multiple monitoring wells. We make a specific recommendation against nested wells in the same borehole. This is just, the practice has moved beyond that. So either multiple monitoring wells in separate boreholes or a multi-level cased monitoring system. We recommend 1 up gradient and 2 down gradient wells. This is to try to get some control over spatial variability and water quality. And that those wells be located within 1/2 mile, which is approximately 1 kilometer. In other studies, methane has been seen to be elevated within 1 kilometer of natural gas wells. We encourage the operators to submit project plans that include more than 1 monitoring well, in which case some of these monitoring wells may serve to monitor more than 1 stimulation well. Now, having given you a typical example, we do encourage that or recommend that groundwater monitoring be risk-based, so that stimulated wells with higher probability of impacting groundwater be monitored more intensively. And more intensively is, monitoring closer to the stimulated well, monitoring more aquifers, or monitoring more locations in each aquifer. The risk factors that we identified are potential transport pathways in close proximity, well stimulation density, and vertical separation. Was there a question? Oh, sure. I'm going to go through each of these. Transport pathways in close proximity. The concern here is the capture of hydro-induced fractures by an active or an inactive or an abandoned well in close proximity. And here the real concern is inadequately constructed or abandoned wells. And when we say inadequate, we recommend that offset wells meet the groundwater protection standard that was put forward in the Department of Conservation Draft Environmental Impact Report. And, the most relevant aspect of that standard is that the outer annular space be filled with cement from the surface to a confining unit below groundwater with 10,000 ppm TDS, so that we would judge wells that meet the standard as potential pathways and wells that do not meet the standard as likely pathways. And close proximity is defined by the stimulation area. Dogger uses ADSA. This is a good approach, but we recommend that the geomechanical model used to estimate the ADSA be validated by field data specific to that formation, that field, and that operation, and that in addition to maximum length, height, and thickness, the azimuthal angle uncertainty also be submitted. And we also recommend that when field data, relevant field data are not available, a more conservative cylindrical estimate of stimulated volume be used that assumes azimuth is not known. And in these terms, close proximity is 2 ADSA for wells and then 5 ADSA for geologic features. You don't always know where geologic features are located with the same level of precision as wells. So well density, The number of stimulated wells within a half mile of stimulated well in California varies by orders of magnitude, from exploratory wells that may have less than 4 wells within a half mile to, in densely drilled fields, there may be up to 800 wells or over 800 wells within a half mile. And we believe that in these fields, if there is protected water that's not exempt, there should be more monitoring. And the reason I said that 3, and specifically, we recommend the monitoring of a third aquifer in these wells. And so the reason I said that 3 aquifers would be typical is that most wells, stimulated wells in California, are in densely drilled fields. Bell Ridge in red is an extreme example, but even in non-Bell Ridge fields, most of them have more than 50 wells within a half mile. Okay, vertical separation. This is the separation or the distance between the hydrocarbon zone and protected groundwater. And the concern here, the public concern has always been propagation of induced fractures into protected groundwater, but there's also a concern with the intersection of these induced fractures with geologic features such as faults or fractures, and then propagation into protected groundwater. This is an issue in California. Stimulated wells in California tend to be shallow, and the vertical separation does vary by field. So there are instances where the vertical separation is not going to be thousands of feet. So we have a minimum vertical separation requirement, and this is binary. If it's not met, then well stimulation should not be permitted. So we put this all together into a matrix to basically say what would be required in each of these cases from site to site. I'm not going to go through everything. I just want to highlight some things. If a minimum vertical separation is not met, a groundwater monitoring plan would not be approved, and you guys have that leverage. For most aquifers, for most sites, 2 aquifers would be required to be monitored, a shallow, high-quality freshwater aquifer and a aquifer near the base of protected water. For high-density sites, a 3rd aquifer would be required to be monitored at the base of the 0 to 3,000 ppm groundwater zone. And then for stimulation sites in which there are wells that do not meet the groundwater protection standard advocated, this would require additional review, and it would require either they go back in and they seal those wells, or there be additional monitoring requirements. That could be more aquifers monitored. That could be more locations per aquifer. Okay, so the 2 important points are that we also, if a site conceptual model can be developed, we recommend that operators be allowed and encouraged to propose an alternative plan. And also, this is all based on, low volume vertical fractures with gel-based bi-wing fracture patterns. If well stimulation in California changes, looks more like what's being done in North Dakota, Pennsylvania, or Texas, then these criteria should be revisited. Okay, for analytes, the considerations were regulated constituents, unregulated toxic or stimulation-specific constituents, the potential for the constituent to have detectable impact from oil and gas operations, and the utility in being able to distinguish the source of the contamination. So being able to distinguish agriculture from oil and gas, well stimulation from non-well stimulation. And we recommend a tiered approach. For the first tier set of analytes, we did take into account commercial availability and the availability of standardized analytical protocols. The second tier would only be done if there was some evidence for impact or evidence consistent with impact, and that would be specifically geared towards toxic chemical additives that were used in that specific well stimulation.
So when you say potential for impact, you mean because of the nature of that particular chemical or because of the nature of the well field?
Oh, but the potential for detectable impact. We mean constituents that are present in produced waters, for example, or in injected waters in sufficient concentrations that if there were a leak or a breach, you would actually be able to see it in a groundwater sample.
What do you mean about the second tier of analytes? Evidence for
So essentially, you know, we have a fairly broad suite of analytes for the first tier, and I'll go into that. We establish a baseline, and then if changes are seen in a groundwater sample away from that baseline that are consistent with impact from oil and gas operation, changes in salinity and total petroleum hydrocarbons, then we would go back, recommend going back and resampling and looking for some of these toxic chemical additives. And like I said, you know, there's two parts to this. One is actually detecting a statistically significant change in water quality, and the other is determining whether or not it's consistent with impact. That second part is the reason for the broad suite of analytes that we recommend. And in all of this, establishing a baseline is absolutely critical. You know, we need to determine what the spatial temporal variability is to detect statistically significant changes. We need to characterize legacy impacts. And so we recommend semi-annual monitoring for 3 years, followed by a fairly comprehensive review of the data. And we also recommend a specific approach to detecting statistically significant changes, but would allow the operators to propose a comparable method. The analytes we propose are a slight expansion of what was in the interim regulation. Most of what we added are either to determine the origin of methane, you know, looking at ethane and propane, looking at isotopic composition of methane, determine whether it's, you know, biogenic and not associated with oil and gas, or thermogenic and associated with oil and gas. And then stable isotopes of oxygen and hydrogen. This is a very inexpensive analysis. It's already being used to look for produced pond seepage into shallow groundwaters. Very useful. In the report, we have an 8-page table that goes into each of these compound classes, the standardized method used, the sample volume and detection limit, and then a rationale for why we're including it on our recommended list. You know, SB4 requires appropriate indicator compounds for well stimulation fluid. You know, guar gum is the only one we specifically recommend. It's the most commonly used additive. It's a relatively simple analysis. And then we recommend that the operators choose 2 additional additives on the basis of their mass in that stimulation and their persistence in the environment. And the reason we do that is because, you know, there's been over 300 different chemicals and chemical mixtures used in California, and each stimulation uses, you know, on average 23 individual additives, and they vary from stimulation to stimulation. So it doesn't make sense to specify, you know, specific chemicals to be monitored. The second tier analytes are only analyzed if we see changes that we think might be, you know, consistent with well stimulation treatment. And they were chosen the basis of their toxicity and their uniqueness to well stimulation. These are surfactants, alcohols and glycols, biocides, and then any tracers that were introduced. Oops, sorry. Moving quickly on to regional monitoring components, you know, we think the program should have 3 goals or components. One is just to detect the migration of oil and gas fluids, liquids or gases, out of isolated hydrocarbon zones into protected groundwater. And in this, we don't distinguish between well stimulation, enhanced oil recovery, underground injection control. This will require mapping of protected groundwater resources, and will also require development of new, you know, conceptual models, which we kind of highlight in that last bullet. And then monitoring the impact of produced water ponds on shallow groundwater, and then finally investigating the impact of wellbore integrity. The issue here is that the contaminant pathways of most concern are not unique to well stimulation. They're primarily through wastewater disposal, either at the surface in produced water ponds, or when we actually inject those produced waters back into the subsurface. Then there's also a concern with well integrity. The primary concern is salinity and natural constituents in formation fluids and produced fluids, not the chemical additives associated with well stimulation. And those chemical additives are not unique to well stimulation. So, we have some specific recommendations about water quality monitoring. It should start with the same list as for the area-wide monitoring, but it should also include more specialized analyses of intrinsic tracers of source and transport that have been used elsewhere for these types of studies, certain isotopic analyses, and then noble gases, and then also age tracers such as tritium and radiocarbon. And then, monitoring select samples for toxic and indicator compounds. A really important recommendation is that the Regional Monitor Program have access to samples collected in other programs, and that means specifically to produced water. The approach is going to be using the geochemical signature of the groundwater sample to try to determine whether or not there is a produced water component. And the only way you can do that is to know what the geochemical signature of the produced water component is. So they need access to these samples, and this will require coordination with industry. And then finally, these are the last three slides. This is all brand new. This full disclosure of chemical additives, systematic groundwater monitoring of new well stimulation projects, regional groundwater monitoring, that is new in the nation and in the world, actually. And monitoring a deep subsurface source is fundamentally different than monitoring a surface source, and it's going to take us a while to come up to speed. And in doing this, we think pilot studies and periodic program review will be important. Pilot studies and special studies are needed to kind of address some significant gaps in our understanding of the impact of oil and gas on groundwater and how to identify and monitor those impacts. And these studies should be, designed and conducted in coordination with industry under the guidance of a technical advisory committee. There's a lot of expertise out there. And then in collaboration with the USGS, the national laboratories, and universities. There is also a need for ongoing data and program review. What we really need to do is develop an information management system that we need a database, and not just data, not PDFs of analytical results, but a database. And that database, we'd like to see that database expand beyond just chemical analytical data to also include hydrogeologic, geologic, geophysical data that is relevant to this enterprise, or links to relevant information generated by other programs. GeoTracker is an excellent start. Expanding beyond that is probably necessary. And then we also recommend establishing a technical advisory committee. This would allow a mechanism for adaptive management or feedback, could assist in the review and design of special studies, and could evaluate how well some of these components of the monitoring programs, including network design, analyte list, frequency of duration, and sampling, are actually working. So that's all I have. I'd be happy to.
I would go back a ways. I just have one question. So when you have the recommendations for let's see, this would be slide number 21, risk-based groundwater monitoring. Within the regulatory recommendations, when we have these sort of hard stops, where you say well stimulation is not allowed, I'm just I want to call attention to that here you're recommending that beyond the volume around well stimulation and the 2 times volume, and then you've added 100 foot as a conservative
Right.
buffer, as a and I'm curious, when you take a regulatory recommendation like that and then hindcast it on existing operations, if there would have been some examples, some areas where vertical separation wasn't as much as we thought, how does that translate into the landscape
Right.
in terms of how many we might not have approved looking back?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer. Preston might? This is Preston Jordan.
This was an interesting revelation. Well, revelation. It was just very good information that you presented at the April workshop about this issue of vertical separation, and so this is kind of comes out of that analysis, and it's worth discussing, I think.
Yeah, and I think it comes to the question of,
Introduce
sorry,
yourself.
yes, Preston Jordan, Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Thank you for letting us do this work for you and on behalf of the state. This comes down to the question of not having a firm understanding, I would say, of the distribution of water quality, which is one of the slides that came up earlier. So I think it would be a very hard question to answer at this point, because the research is ongoing to determine where does the deepest 10,000 ppm aquifer occur in terms of total dissolved solids. So without knowing where that aquifer is, it's hard to say how many stimulations potentially would this have affected. So I mean, it's something we could look into. I think it's an excellent question. And Dr. Janice Gillespie, who's at California State University, Bakersfield, has been doing a lot of work on this. And so it might be that I can get together with her based on my knowledge of the depths with which stimulations have been occurring, and she's been working on the distribution of water quality, and we might be able to come up with some ballpark answer for you on that if you're interested.
And really, I don't mean to create work here that's of academic nature, but it's just a question that comes up in my mind.
Sure.
I didn't expect you to have the set answer, but it might
Yeah.
be a small universe or larger, and it seems like we just
I know. I think knowing the implications would be
Thanks.
useful.
Thank you. Thank you for your work, and thank you for the presentation. I wanted to get further away. Explore one component of what you said. I absolutely agree that early detection of leakage of individual stimulation is not the goal for area-specific monitoring, but it is a tool, and especially as you talk about risk-based monitoring and identifying, through tiers what the higher risk operations are, and you talk about, what determines risk in terms of pathways and density and vertical separation. I'm curious, what role could real-time pressure monitoring of individual stimulation play in determining risk? And in addition to that, I wanted to follow up a little bit on your comment that the real-time pressure testing would identify major leaks but not minor. What does that mean? And if you can, if you can expand upon, at least in your understanding, how real-time monitoring could help with your recommendation of identifying risk as well as doing more intense monitoring for higher risk activities. One of the things that you're proposing is monitoring closer to the stimulated well. Well, real-time testing is monitoring of the actual stimulated well. So again, I'm just curious to explore that particular aspect.
Yeah, so there's several questions there. Let me answer one question in terms of the distance, the distance between the monitoring well and the stimulation well. There I was specifically referring to, if you look at this table and when it says proximity, pathways in close proximity, none known, and then at the other end it says type of well, regional or area. What we, in our recommendations, we say that a regional well within 1 mile of the stimulated well would meet the requirement for groundwater monitoring for a stimulated well that has no known transport pathways within close proximity. So that's the, monitoring closer or monitoring further. Are you monitoring within a half mile, which will be the case for most wells, or are you monitoring within a mile? In terms of the real-time pressure monitoring, the first thing to state is that if there is a pressure anomaly that's indicative of fluid loss out of zone, then the operator would be required to try to isolate where that loss occurred, and then a contingency plan would need to be developed with the water board. I mean, we don't comment on that, but that is a primary role for the real-time monitoring, identifying if there's potential loss of fluids, and then triggering additional monitoring to address that loss of fluids. In terms of major loss and minor loss, the real-time monitoring and also some of the introduced radioactive tracers that they introduce is designed to demonstrate that the fluids that they inject go where they intend to inject them. But there are pressure fluctuations, and I'm going to have Vic Madrid, one of my colleagues, come up here and maybe talk about this a little bit more. The pressure anomalies or fluctuations that are detectable are such that there could be some small loss of fluids that would not result in a large enough pressure anomaly to actually report to the water board. So,
And help me understand if it's so small that it's not,
well,
detect.
I think that
How is that considered part of the risk analysis?
I think that our concern is that when you have 800 wells within a half mile of a stimulated well, if there are minor losses of fluid associated with each of those wells, the cumulative effect could be, you could have a cumulative effect that would have a significant impact on groundwater quality. And if you're doing that over decades, so that's the concern.
Hello, my name is Vic Madrid. I'm at Lawrence Livermore Lab working with Brad. First of all, I want to say I'm not closer? Is that better? Is that better? Yeah, first of all, I want to say I'm not an expert in assessing real-time pressure monitoring of well stimulation, but I do want to say that this aspect of monitoring at the time of the stimulation is probably some of the most diagnostic information that you can collect to determine whether the procedure went as intended and to detect major fluid losses or detect the possibility of an unintended event. So that's probably the most diagnostic monitoring that could be done to determine whether something essentially went wrong at the time that the stimulation occurred. And then that would trigger as Brad said, some kind of groundwater monitoring response action, right? That would include collecting all the information that was collected during as a result of the pressure monitoring to try to define, if you could, to define where the breach occurred, if a breach occurred, and then from that information and whatever information exists in terms of a site conceptual model to try to put together some kind of response action in terms of installation of groundwater monitor wells to see whether protected groundwater has been impacted. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm Vic Madrid and I'm a hydrogeologist at Lawrence Livermore Lab and I work with Brad, so, yeah.
John, do you have something to add?
I just wanted to make sure the board was aware that that pressure monitoring of the activity is required under the Doggers regulations, and so.
And one more comment, I think that's, this is crucial information. So if anything, coordination between the operators, the water board, and for example, Dogger, in terms of the quality of the information that's being collected and the transparency of that information, I think is going to be crucial to protecting groundwater in the future related to well stimulations.
Thank you, and I appreciate the emphasis on coordination and maximizing the use of all available data, including those from Dogger as well as those from, say, the Irrigated Lands Program, SIGMA, and other related efforts.
And this is an important point, and, along these lines, on page 18 of the red line strikeout on change sheet number 1, there is new language in the proposed model criteria document about submittal of a contingency plan outlining actions to be taken by the operator in case of a well failure or breach, so that, as Mr. Esser noted, it wouldn't be you develop the plan when the breach occurs. Actually, you have the plan and you implement the contingency plan if a well failure or breach occurs. So that appeared to be a beneficial addition in the change sheet.
All right, this may seem an obvious question, but just to ask. So given your recommendations, given the proposed regs, are you comfortable?
Yes. Yes, I am.
I know that puts you in an
I think
awkward
that our,
situation, but I just want to know.
No. I mean, our recommendations are more specific than the regulations, which is probably appropriate. I think the regulations state that a minimum of 2 aquifers be monitored, but allows for the monitoring of additional aquifers based on site-specific conditions.
Right.
And where we make recommendations is on which site-specific recommendation should trigger additional monitoring.
Would you care, because I noticed the level of specificity is much greater in this, is that what your report proposes is in some ways guidance to our team on how to implement this?
I would hope so.
Chair Marcus, that's the way we see it also, that we would be looking at the information submitted in their technical report and using that to evaluate a groundwater monitoring plan that's submitted and potentially asking for additional monitoring if some of these conditions are triggered above the minimum.
So now I'd like to turn it over to Janice, but before I do that, for an overview of what the model criteria changes are and what the model criteria are, I'd like to point out that we're joined today by Steve Bolin, who's the supervisor of the Division of Oil and Gas and Geothermal Resources. So if there are any more specific oil-related questions, he'd be happy to answer those.
Good morning, Chair Marcus and members of the board. Today I'll be summarizing for you some of the significant changes that we've made to the model criteria. Changes made based on the public and stakeholder feedback and the recommendations. But first I wanted to just go over a couple basic slides to bring you back up to speed. As John said, the model criteria outline the methods to be used in assessing the potential effects of well stimulation on groundwater resources. We'll be looking at all beneficial uses of groundwater, but the priority will be to monitor drinking water sources or those sources that potentially could be a drinking water source. So there are 3 main components monitoring in the model criteria. The first one is the area-specific groundwater monitoring that will be conducted by the well operators. We also include requirements for the designated sampling, that is for property owner requested sampling. And we also include criteria for regional groundwater monitoring that will be implemented by the state water. Mike, yeah, there we go, okay. So we've had many previous public meetings in the past year, but more recently, we have released the draft model criteria on April 29th for the 30-day public comment period. A revised draft model criteria was released again on June 23rd. In all, we received 26 letters from the public stakeholders, public and stakeholders. The Water Board staff reviewed all the comments, and we met with stakeholder groups and carefully considered all the input. We've made changes to the model criteria based on these comments and also based on the recommendations from Lawrence Livermore. And I will go over some of the significant changes for you in the following slides.
I would just point out that all those months are in the same year, which is a little different than our usual.
You know, I was going to wait till the end to say, way to go, meeting a deadline, that's great, yeah.
So for the
Duly noted.
introduction, oh, excuse me. Clarifying text has been added to the introduction, indicating that the model criteria aren't meant for site investigation and cleanup monitoring or work, and they're not designed for early detection of impacts, as Brad was saying. But rather, the model criteria are designed to collect information in areas that we don't know much about and establish a baseline where then in the future we can look for potential impacts to groundwater. Oops. Also, Water Board staff can consider proposed alternatives. We've added some flexibility, so we can look at modifications to our model criteria based on site-specific conditions, terrain, access, how many protected water aquifers there are, how many groundwater resources there are in the area that may be potential receptors. However, a modification must not impair our ability to assess the potential impacts of the well stimulation. So we removed the 200 gallon per day yield requirement from the definition of protected water, since that yield requirement is derived from establishing a source of drinking water. Since SB4 requires us to look at all beneficial uses, we decided that the yield component would be removed, since it's based on drinking water. So now our protected water is defined as water with less than 10,000 milligrams per liter, TDS, and outside of an exempted aquifer. And this is the same approach that we've been using in the interim regs. We've also made some modifications to the groundwater monitoring design. When multiple aquifers with protected water are penetrated by the stimulated well or group of wells, we require that a minimum of 2 of those aquifers be monitored. One is the shallow protected water, and the other is the deep protected water. And the shallow protected water refers to the shallowest aquifer containing the protected water, and the deep protected water refers to a deeper aquifer and preferably near the base of all the protected waters, closest to the zone of stimulation. Of course, additional aquifers may be required based on site-specific conditions like we were talking about.
Kind of a minor issue, but in the proposed language in the change sheet, you refer to base of protected water, but you don't have that clarifying statement you just had, which is closest to the area of well stimulation. Maybe we need it, maybe we don't, but it does make it clearer that that's the intent when we say the deep protected water is the base of protected water.
Closest to the zone of stimulation.
Yes, that's not
ideally.
actually in the regulation language. I don't know if it needs to be.
So I believe it is. Preferably near the base of protected water is the way that's described in the regulation.
Right, yeah, that's the language. I was just saying the language closest to the zone of stimulation is not in the proposed regulatory
That
language.
piece. Okay.
One of those things where the clarity in plain language and regulation, is it useful to have it there? It's a question I have. I don't. Okay, sorry to interrupt.
There may be some areas that it will be significantly deep, so that we wanted it close to the base of protected water. So here's a demonstration of the minimum of the two aquifers to be monitored. Here we show the shallow protected water and the deep protected water where monitoring would be required, with the deep protected water being closest to the zone of stimulation. So we've also added some clarifying language on the location of the wells. Monitoring wells are to be located within a half mile of the surface of the projection of the zone of stimulation. Clarifying language has been added to describe that the monitoring well shall be located within a half mile of the perimeter of the surface projection of the zones of a stimulated group of wells or well. And I have a figure here to help with that. So here we show the wells to undergo stimulation. The ones that look a lot like a pipe cleaner, those are wells that are directionally drilled. So their zone of stimulation is actually at some distance subsurfacely from the wellhead. The other ones are vertical. So if we draw a perimeter, that's the yellow line, outlining the perimeter of all those wells, then the monitoring wells would need to be located within a half a mile of that perimeter. And of course, we have at a minimum, 1 up gradient and 2 down gradient, but additional wells for larger groups of stimulated wells. So the groundwater monitoring plan requirements now include a contingency plan, as we were talking about earlier, outlines actions for a well breach or a well failure. The contingency plan is to include a conceptual framework for monitoring well locations and depths, conceptual model of where they would be installing these wells. They won't know the depth, but how they would be constructed. So text has also been added to clarify that the final water board's approval of groundwater monitoring plans will not occur prior to Dogger approving the ADSA information. Those review can happen in parallel as far as Dogger reviewing the ADSA and approving that. We can also move forward and approve or review our groundwater monitoring plan, but it would be based on a approved ADSA from Dogger. So the list of required analytes has been moved to the appendix. We propose a tiered approach as Lawrence Livermore had recommended. And based on the results, we've added flexibility that the State Water Board may modify the list of required analytes. If the analytical results indicate potential impacts, the water boards, we may require additional analytes to be tested.
Is that a situation where it could go the other way too, just for clarity? I mean, we can add some if we have problem areas or questions, but we can also have some flexibility to reduce the number of analytes maybe over time if monitoring shows a lack of detection.
Right. I think after we establish baseline conditions and look at the analyte list, we can reevaluate which ones are required.
It goes both ways. Thanks.
So as far as the reporting requirements, operators' water quality report is to include an analysis of the data collected and identification of any potential impacts, and they will need to propose necessary actions if impacts are identified. And we've added that the report needs to be signed by a California registered professional geologist or engineer. For the regional monitoring program, text has been added to clarify that the monitoring will leverage the use of monitoring wells from other programs where available. Also, data reports will be made publicly available, and formal reports are anticipated to be prepared every 2 years starting January 2018. So moving forward, the model criteria will be used to satisfy groundwater monitoring requirements for the well stimulation permits issued by Dogger. And these model criteria do not apply to well stimulation permits associated with groundwater monitoring plans that were approved in the interim or prior to the adoption of these criteria. Written concurrences for the exclusion of groundwater monitoring issued prior to the adoption of these criteria will remain in effect unless future information indicates the presence of protected water in the areas that we've granted written concurrence. And because it'll take a considerable amount of time for appropriate level of regional monitoring data to be collected, and that the monitoring network is fully established, the development of a threshold criteria between area-specific to regional monitoring program is not included at this time. However, operators can use regional monitoring program wells where approved by State Water Board staff. So to highlight some of the additions and important elements of the proposed resolution, staff will collaborate with stakeholders to develop performance measures for the evaluation of the model criteria by March 1st of 2016. Also, the model criteria supports and encourages monitoring approaches that leverage the use of existing data and groundwater monitoring programs such as the Irrigated Lands or the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And the resolution allows staff to enter into necessary agreements to begin implementation of these model criteria. And that's the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Questions?